You're watching BBC News. I'm Sumi Somaskanda live at the White House, where we're following the very latest today on those talks taking place between President Trump and Zelensky. We've just heard the latest lines coming through that President Trump has said that after his meetings with President Zelensky and European leaders today, he will hold a call with President Putin. He said that President Putin is waiting for his call. Remember, just a few days after President Putin met with President Trump for their summit in Alaska. So interesting to see this is being closely coordinated. And of course, President Trump has said he wants a trilateral summit with President Zelensky and Putin. Now, it was just a short while ago that we saw President Zelensky arrive here at the Oval Office. We have some images of that for you here. In remarks to the press, Mr. Trump said very substantial progress was made in efforts to find peace. Mr. Zelensky thanked the U.S. leader prominently for his attempts to stop the killing. This is the first time we've seen President Zelensky here since that meeting in February. Let's listen to what both leaders said to the press.
We're meeting with 7 great leaders of great countries also, and we'll be talking about that. They'll all be involved, but there'll be a lot of help. When it comes to security, there's going to be a lot of help. It's going to be good. They are first line of defense because they're there. They're Europe. But we're going to help them out also. We'll be involved.
Vladimir Putin mentioned that the war will not end without addressing the root causes of this war. Have you had an understanding what are the root causes of this war?
Well, look, the war is going to end. When it ends, I can't tell you, but the war is going to end, and this gentleman wants it to end, and Vladimir Putin wants it to end. I think the whole world is tired of it, and we're going to get it ended. It was, I've done 6 wars. I've ended 6 wars, and I thought this maybe would be the easiest one, and it's not the easiest one. It's a tough one. A lot of reasons for it, and they'll be talking about it for a long time. But they'll be talking about the others. Look, India, Pakistan. We're talking about big places. When you look at, you just take a look at some of these wars. You go to Africa and take a look at that. Rwanda and the Congo, Republic of the Congo. That's been going on for 31 years. And so we've done a total of 6, and we really have 6, not including the fact that we obliterated, and it turned out to be a total obliteration, the nuclear, as you said, the future nuclear capability of Iran. And this one, I think we're going to get solved also. I feel confident we're going to get it solved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Can you tell us about your conversations with European leaders and what they need to see to support an end to the war?
Yeah, well, we're going to be meeting with a great representative group and 7 very powerful, very big countries and great people, all friends of mine and friends of yours. And we're going to have some suggestions made. They want to see peace. They would like to see peace. In the red.
President Trump, do you think it's fair for Ukraine and for Russia to achieve a lasting and durable peace if Ukraine cedes its territories that Russia hasn't yet conquered? Do you think it's a fair peace for Ukraine?
We're going to have a lasting peace. Just to answer the first part of your question, we're going to have a lasting peace. I hope it's going to be immediately. I hope it doesn't have to go on. And I think people of the whole world is going to be very happy when that's announced.
Mr. President, you posted on social media, Mr. President, a very touching letter from the First Lady. And the letter was hand-delivered to President Putin. And it calls for an end to the war, essentially, because of the children and the children's future. Why did the First Lady feel that letter was necessary? Was it because she believes that Mr. Putin is the aggressor in the war? Is a similar letter being hand-delivered to President Zelensky?
So the First Lady felt very strongly. She's watched the same thing that you watch and that I watch. I see things that you don't get to see, and it's horrible. But when she's got a great love of children, she has a wonderful son that she loves, probably more than anybody, including me. I hate to say it, but she loves her son. She loves children. And she hates to see something like this happening, and that goes for other wars too. I mean, she sees the the heartbreak, the parents, the funerals that you see on television, always funerals. We want to see something other than funerals. No, she felt it was a beautiful letter. It was very well received by him. And she did ask me to say, you know, she would love to see this end. She would love to see it end. And she says it very openly, very proudly, and with great sorrow because so many people have been killed.
Mr. President, last week,
Brian, go ahead, Brian.
Yes, sir. I've got a question for each of you.
Yes.
First of all, Mr. President Zelensky, you look fabulous in that suit.
I said the same thing.
Yeah, you look good.
I said the same thing.
Yeah, looks good on
I
you.
said the one that attacked you last time. See, now I remember that.
I apologize to you. You look wonderful. No, my first question for you, President Zelensky.
In the same suit. You see, I changed, you are not.
Maybe yours is much better. Real quickly, upon peace, God willing we get peace, are you open to holding an election in your country?
Yes, of course. We are open for election, yes. We have to do safety circumstances. And a little bit, we need to work in the parliament, because during the war you can't have elections, but we can do security. We need, maybe, how to say, we need a truth, yes, everywhere, in the battlefield, in the sky, in the sea, yeah, to make possible for people to do democratic, open, legal elections.
So you say
we're ready.
during the war you can't have elections. So let me just say 3.5 years from now. So you mean if we happen to be in a war with somebody, no more elections? Oh, this kid. I wonder what.
So there's that exchange between President Trump and Zelensky, notably. Let's see, I think we're just working on my microphone. Just to get my microphone up. Apologies, we just dropped my microphone here for a moment, but hopefully you can hear us now. It's quite busy here at the White House, and it's a bit of a crush, so our equipment has been a bit back and forth. But hopefully you can hear me now. Was just saying that here at the White House, we have seen that meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. Different body language, wasn't it, than we saw in February. But let's bring in BBC Verify's Nick Beek, who is standing by for us now. Nick, you know, interesting to see that exchange between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. And President Trump, going back to a few points we've heard him made very often, first on funding for this war, U.S. funding. What stood out to you there?
Yeah, that's right, Sumin. I thought it was really interesting listening to some of the questions that were posed to President Trump and President Zelensky. And they were questions that represent a part of the US media and the US electorate who really feel that the ongoing war in Ukraine is a drain on American resources and also on the president's time, that he'd be better served investing all his efforts in making America great again, as they would characterize it. And it was interesting, I thought, Sumi, at one point, the president, who throughout was characterizing the Ukraine war as Joe Biden's war, he said that the Americans had spent more than $300 billion on the Ukraine war. Now, at BBC Verify, we've looked at this claim time and again because the president has made it on a number of occasions. And if we look at the figures, if you look at the Kiel Institute, a German-based think tank, it says that from the start of January 2022, just before the full-scale invasion, to the end of the Biden administration, in fact, $130 billion were spent on the war. So that's far lower than the $300 billion that President Trump is claiming. And by the US government's own figures, they say it's something like $180 billion. So that figure much lower than what the president is claiming.
And Nick, he's also spoken countless times, really, in the last few weeks about the number of those who have been killed in the war. What stood out to you there?
Yes, well, the president was saying that he wants the war to stop, he wants the killing to end, and this has become a regular refrain. I think at one point it was striking that he said millions have been killed in the war in Ukraine. Millions. Now, the figures do not back that up in any way. Yes, this has been a horrific war in terms of the number of people who've been killed. If we look at some of the casualty figures, and BBC Verify has been tracking this over the past 2.5 years, the figures that we can ascertain, and bearing in mind that neither side puts out regular updates of the number of soldiers who've been killed. Why would they do that? There's no incentive for them to do that. But certainly, if we look at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, based here in Washington, D.C., they estimate that around 250,000 Russian soldiers, so 250,000 Russian soldiers, have been killed in this conflict. They estimate between 60,000 and 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. They also talk about the number of people who've been killed on the battlefield, but their bodies have not been able to be retrieved, so the figure could be even higher. Of course, when you're looking at Ukraine, the number of civilians who've been killed in drone attacks, in missile attacks, this terror that people have faced night after night for more than 2.5 years now. So undoubtedly, there is a very large number of people who've been killed here. In the hundreds of thousands, it would certainly seem, if we look at all the available evidence, but not millions, as President Trump was saying today.
Okay, Nick Beake from BBC Verify, thank you for clearing that information up for us. Very good to have you on. Let's bring in now Sir Simon Fraser. He was a permanent secretary at the UK Foreign Office from 2010 to 2015. He's now the chair of the Chatham House. Sir Simon, very good to have you with us. We know that these talks are now ongoing. We anticipate European leaders will be meeting with President Trump soon as well. Take us through what you thought really was important listening to President Trump just there. He talked about a ceasefire really being something he would like, but something that's not workable.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I guess the first thing to say is we've just witnessed the latest episode of the Donald Trump reality diplomacy show, and I do find these experiences a bit dispiriting. But if you cut through to what was actually said, I think there were three key things that came across to me. First of all, he was quite cautious in his expectation of what could be achieved. He kept talking about having a good chance of success rather than we will get it done. And of course, as you say, he did talk about the next phase being a trilateral meeting between the three leaders. I thought that was interesting. Secondly, there was definitely a shift or a clear commitment that the US would play a part, some sort of role in supporting security guarantees for Ukraine in future. That's not what he was saying before, and that is a change. And thirdly, of course, he wouldn't be drawn on whether there needed to be a ceasefire before wider negotiations took place. Now, that reflects the Putin position, but I think the Ukrainians and the Europeans definitely believe, and I agree with them, that there will need to be a ceasefire first. So those were three interesting points that came out for me.
So, Simon, if you look at the perspective of European leaders here, President Trump a few times during that media availability pointing to the fact that those leaders were waiting in another room. What do you think it would take for them to convince President Trump that a ceasefire must be in place? Just look at what happened, of course, in Ukraine overnight with 10 more people killed.
Well, I just think it's the reality. First of all, I think it's good that they're there, both to give support to President Zelensky, but also to make the point very clearly to the United States that if they want Europe to foot the bill for arming Ukraine and for providing security guarantees, then Europeans need to be at the table. That's really important. So it's good to see that. Now, the other point is, I just think the reality is that if there isn't a ceasefire, the idea that you can have ongoing negotiations while the fighting is going on about a territorial settlement is really difficult. And actually, it's contradictory in Donald Trump's position, because he says he wants the war to end fast, but on the other hand, he says, I don't need a ceasefire, the war can continue while we do the negotiation. So I think that will be an important part of the discussion.
He did also point to the fact that NATO countries are buying weapons for Ukraine now. Do you think that that makes it more likely that the U.S. is willing to participate in security guarantees going forward?
Well, first of all, I think it's good that it gives the Europeans a bit more leverage, because after all, they are spending money to provide these weapons to Ukraine, and that's good. I do also think that the penny has dropped, and it's just a harsh reality that, frankly, the Europeans cannot put together a credible deterrent security guarantee on their own without American backing. And indeed, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has been quite rightly been saying this from the very start. So that is a bit of progress in terms of giving credibility to the whole process.
Okay, Sir Simon Fraser, very good to have you with us on BBC News. Thank you for that analysis.
Thank you.
Let's get more of the view from here on the ground, and I have with me my colleague Asma Khalid, who is a long-time White House reporter here, of course, in Washington, and also now is our colleague at BBC, now the co-host of the Global Story podcast, which is launching very soon. But Asma, I want to ask you from your experience. Of course, you were here in February during that blow-up between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. Things did look very different this time around.
It was a complete transformation. I would say down to just the conversation that Trump and Zelensky had in the Oval Office. Sumi, it was so volatile last time that there are moments that are stuck in my mind, right? Vice President Vance saying that Zelensky did not say thank you, for example. President Trump saying that Zelensky didn't have the cards. There was none of that high temper emotion this time around. In fact, you heard Zelensky say thank you multiple times. You heard him, you saw him wear a suit jacket, which is no accident.
Which they talked about, didn't they?
Which they spoke about, in part because that was something that was raised last time by someone in the room. So I would say, it feels transformatively different in terms of the tone, the temperature feels very different. Sumi, when I was here last time, there was supposed to be a press conference that was held. That press conference never took place. As I'm sure many viewers remember, we were over on the other side of the White House waiting to go in when very quickly Zelensky was ushered out. He was told to leave the White House, and we saw his motorcade just rush out very quickly. We got some intel from White House advisors that he was told explicitly to leave during that last occasion.
So certainly a very different reception this time, in part because you have European leaders here at the White House as well. We know that it could still, however, be a tense meeting. I mean, just give us a sense of what you make of President Trump's mindset and the messaging we've heard from him going in today's meeting.
Yeah, I think, Sumi, it to me has been very striking that over the last several weeks, I would say here in Washington, the sense was that Trump might be changing his tone a bit with Vladimir Putin. You heard him publicly take to social media, calling on Putin to stop certain bombing campaigns. And at the same time, you seem to see a bit of sympathy, or empathy, you should say, towards the Ukrainian vision. I think what is striking is since Friday, we are seeing a bit of that shift again. It is very clear to me that President Trump wants a peace deal, and a peace deal, I would say, at all costs. What I am very curious to see is how the Europeans sort of take that proposal. What concessions are willing to be made? You did not hear President Trump refer to a ceasefire. You heard him refer to a peace deal. To me, that is different than just a cessation of hostility.
Okay, Asma Khalid, always great to get your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we know that President Trump has said he will actually call President Putin after today's talk. So they are coordinating very closely. And indeed, he has said he wants to see a trilateral meeting next. So we're going to continue to follow everything here at the White House, waiting for more lines on what is happening inside at the moment. But we'll take a short break. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Well, we're here at the White House where, of course, those talks between President Zelensky and Trump are taking place, and European leaders on hand as well. How exactly those meetings are unfolding, well, we don't know just yet. We have some of our correspondents who are in the White House following the latest, and some of them have noted that, of course, this was a different meeting already, looking at the body language between these two leaders. But the very real backdrop to all of this is the continued war in Ukraine, which is why the Ukrainians and the Europeans want to see a ceasefire in place before any peace agreement can be negotiated. Let's go to our correspondent, Katie Watson, who is in Kyiv, because, Katie, we understand as all of this has been happening, there have been further air raid alerts in Kyiv.
Earlier, there was an air raid alert, not directed here in Kyiv, but I think this is exactly what Zelensky is talking about. The president is having this conversation with Donald Trump, trying to explain the very real issue of war here in Ukraine, a war that Ukrainians feel every single day. Every person is affected, friends and family fighting on the front line, and he wants to make that very clear. In the last 48 hours or so since the Alaska summit with Presidents Putin and Trump, repeatedly he has talked about Ukraine's position, the fact that Ukraine wants to find a lasting and secure path to peace, that he needs the US, he needs the European leaders on board to be able to guarantee security for Ukraine, and most of all, he's called Russia a murderous war machine. This is something that he's repeatedly talked about, that Russia is not wanting to cease killings. A ceasefire has to happen before there can be any lasting peace deal. And of course, that is the conversation that no doubt is going on right now. And we heard him obviously talk, not much, but we did hear him starting to have discussions with Trump just a short while ago. So no doubt there'll be more of that discussion going on now.
Yeah, Katie, we're seeing from our correspondents inside that just across the Resolute desk from where Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky were seated, there was a large map of Ukraine on display. And of course, the eastern part of the nation was shaded in pink, and that is territory that the Russian military currently controls. That's about 20% of the country. So a very real reminder on hand there in the Oval Office of what is at stake in terms of territory. This is something that Ukrainians are particularly concerned about, isn't it? It's just what demands might be made in terms of ceding territory in Ukraine.
The two things that they want.
Yeah, and ever since these reports about a potential plan to hand over the Donbass in return for a halt in fighting elsewhere in the country, I've been asking people here in Kyiv what they make of it, and the pretty resounding answer is that that is not a concession. Handing over territory that is Ukrainian to Russia, and Russia shouldn't have taken it in the first place. They do not see that as a concession, and that has been a red line for President Zelensky from the very beginning. That is not the answer. He's also said that he is not allowed to, according to the Ukrainian constitution. So, coming to some kind of mutual agreement on that, I think, will be incredibly difficult. And in fact, that's something that he's wanting to probably avoid talking about until he gets into the conversations with Trump behind closed doors. Exactly what kind of plan did President Putin and Trump come up with in Alaska? And really, is that going to even be accepted by Ukraine? People here have very low expectations that anything's going to come out of these talks.
I don't do
Okay, Katie Watson for us in Kyiv. Thank you for that update from on the ground there. And let's bring in Peter Dickinson, the editor of Ukraine Alert at the Atlantic Council. Peter, thanks for joining us. President Trump seemed very careful with his words there in the Oval Office just now. What did you make of what we heard?
Well, I think the tone was certainly more encouraging than the last time President Zelensky was in the Oval Office. I think that was striking for everyone. A lot more of a rapport seems to have developed between the American and Ukrainian leaders, which obviously is encouraging per se. But broadly speaking, I think Trump seemed to be perhaps toning down expectations of how fast a breakthrough could be achieved, and he certainly didn't seem to be preparing to pile on the pressure onto Zelensky, which is the great fear of many people here in Kyiv, that Zelensky could face a lot of pressure, bullying even, into making concessions that could be very damaging for Ukraine's future national security or even existence as a state. So Ukrainians, I think there's not a huge expectation that these talks will bring a major breakthrough. I think the main concern here is that it could be very damaging for Ukraine. It could put Ukraine box Ukraine into a corner somehow. On the contrary, they're looking Ukraine is hoping, together with the country's European allies, to sort of present a united front to Donald Trump and say, look, we need to be strong against Russia here. Russia only understands strength. And it's no good just talking about concessions. If we want to end the war and have peace, we've got to show the Russians that we mean business to them and that we're going to stand together and be united.
Peter, how much will that united front really be effective, do you think, with President Trump now? You know, he has said he's going to call President Putin after the end of the talks today. So clearly, you know, he has both sides in his ear at the moment with two different priorities.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he seems to go one way and the other, and it's very difficult to draw any conclusions because President Trump's position does seem to fluctuate so much, and you know, the rhetoric, his public rhetoric, it almost changes with the weather, so it can be very difficult to really guess where he's going, where he's leading. I think that Europe has a lot of sway here. Europe is now buying weapons from America to arm Ukraine. Trump wanted Europe to spend a lot more money on their defence. They've agreed to do that. So that they have leverage on the Americans, and that will certainly be playing.
That's an important point that you make, Peter. There, if I may just jump in, that's an important point that you make. There, we've just run out of time, but really good to get your analysis, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us here on BBC News, and we'll be back here with more from the White House in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to the White House. We're following the very latest on the talks today between Presidents Trump and Zelensky and European leaders. Those talks behind us underway. We saw President Zelensky arriving just about an hour and a half ago. They then went into the Oval Office, and we saw President Trump making remarks to the press as well. He said that the United States will be, quote, involved in giving Ukraine security guarantees in the event of a peace settlement with Russia. He gave few details about it, though. Mr. Trump said European countries were the first line of defense. But a Russian foreign ministry spokeswoman reiterated that Russia categorically rejects any military presence in Ukraine from NATO member states. Now, during that press conference earlier, Donald Trump said a ceasefire is not needed to negotiate ending the conflict.
I don't think you need a ceasefire. You know, if you look at the 6 deals that I settled this year, they were all at war. I didn't do any ceasefires. And I know that it might be good to have, but I can also understand strategically why, well, you know, one country or the other wouldn't want it. You have a ceasefire and they rebuild and rebuild and rebuild, and, you know, maybe they don't want that. But if you look at the 6 deals that we made peace and you know, long-term, long-running wars, I didn't do any ceasefires. Would I like the concept. You know, I like the concept of a ceasefire for one reason, because you'd stop killing people immediately, as opposed to in 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever it takes. But we can work a deal where we're working on a peace deal while they're fighting. They have to fight. I wish they could stop. I'd like them to stop. But strategically, that could be a disadvantage for one side or the other. But all of these deals I made without even the mention of the words ceasefire.
President Zelensky, can you explain the decision to offer Ukraine Article 5-like security guarantees, but stop short of pushing for their full membership?
Yeah, well, we haven't done anything on that yet. If you look back and you go back long before President Putin, it was always a statement that they would never allow Ukraine into NATO. So that was a statement that was made, but we haven't discussed any of that yet. We're going to be discussing it today, but we will give them very good protection, very good security. That's part of it. And the people that are waiting for us, they are, I think they're very like-minded. They want to help out also.
That exchange a short while ago here at the White House. Really interesting to see that, of course. Let's bring in our Europe correspondent, James Waterhouse. He's in Brussels. James, I know you've been watching, listening to everything happening here. What did you make of President Trump saying there, not only that Russia said for a long time Ukraine can't join NATO, but that I don't think you need a ceasefire to end the war?
Yeah, Sumi, I mean, first off, time is healing. That went a hell of a lot better than his last visit to the White House. He's already made it to the meeting stage. But what you've just said are the two main hurdles President Zelensky must jump over. Donald Trump, you heard there, didn't rule out America's involvement in Ukraine's long-term security. He also didn't rule out American boots on the ground. That is a change from his stance when he first retook office at the start of the year. There are a lot of curveballs in there potentially, a lot of leading questions that could have derailed proceedings. President Zelensky, he was in full diplomat mode. He's certainly very comfortable in that format. He of course, was a performer before his life in politics. And I think the European lobbying we have seen has both secured their presence, which is clearly on Donald Trump's mind at the moment. He wouldn't be drawn on being sympathetic to Russia. He didn't repeat his previous claims that Russia held all the cards. And he said, look, there could well be a three-way meeting after this if it goes well. But he also entertained the idea that if it doesn't go well, then the fighting would continue. He seems okay with the current model of selling US weapons to Europe and other NATO members for Ukraine. That is a model that is now in place. President Zelensky, as ever, was asking for more, notably air defense systems. So as a start, Sumi, it's a good one. But of course, we are about to embark on the business chunk, where they're going to have this one-on-one, and then his European friends, Zelensky's European friends, will join. So what will they be walking into? I think we've got a photo opportunity coming up. I think it'll be interesting to see the expressions of Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Trump, and see how what strategy these European leaders will deploy when they enter the room.
Yeah, we're just looking at these images of the flags of the European countries here on hand. We're waiting, of course, for a family photo we're expecting to see, James, in a little bit. But that's a really good point, that you see the influence that some of these European leaders have had in their forging of a relationship, a friendship with President Trump. And indeed, he said in the White House, my friends, some of my friends are in the other room. They're your friends as well, turning to President Zelensky. So a key role they're playing. And yet, we didn't hear any talk about what the expectations are for what the future map of Ukraine will look like. And James, that is key, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it is the issue of land. And I think, you know from reporting on that side of the Atlantic how rare it is for such a collection of European leaders to be in one place at the White House for a collective cause, a collective pitch to Donald Trump. But what they will propose or try to shape, as you say, is how a map will be drawn for Ukraine's medium to long-term future. How this war will end is a question of land. And going into this meeting, you've heard what is a very Moscow term of land swaps, the swapping of Ukrainian territory for other parts of Ukrainian territory. If we're talking about swapping, Ukraine doesn't have very much to offer. It has seized slivers of Russian land across the border in small-scale cross-border incursions. It's Russia that has a fifth of Ukraine. So that is something that Ukraine, with the help of Europe, will try to resist strongly. But if there are terms that would allow Ukraine to accept a frozen front line, which we're told is a starting point in these negotiations, then we could see the details thrashed out, and we could see a European, with the blessing of Donald Trump, style proposal that they could bring to for the meeting that Vladimir Putin eventually joined. That's a big if, because if those terms can't be agreed, and you just need to look at what is happening in Ukraine and continues to happen in Ukraine, then the focus will then turn to fighting once more, and Ukraine will have to pivot and just try and secure longer-term military support rather than continuing down this complicated path to some kind of pause in the fighting. But, I think we've got to take things hour by hour. And at the moment, this is a huge opportunity for Volodymyr Zelensky. This Oval Office encounter was a world away from February. He's got his European friends there as backup, where they will then come in and try and streamline the process and build up their proposal. We just wonder what that proposal will be and how it will be received.
And James, just before we let you go, I want to ask you quickly about what you made of President Zelensky's demeanor in the Oval Office. He was asked perhaps some more provocative questions by Trump-aligned media here in the U.S. who have been very critical of Ukraine. Of President Zelensky, who's asked, for example, how many more Ukrainians will you send to their death in fighting the war? How much more do you want from the U.S.? What did you think of how President Zelensky reacted to some of those questions?
I mean, as I say, Sumi, right, this is President Zelensky's domain. I mean, like, some political leaders are far less comfy, aren't they, in press conferences after major conferences where they face often uncontrolled questions by the media. There were a lot of curveballs in there. There was a lot of crossfire. And President Zelensky, he wouldn't have expected that verbal attack last time. You can be sure he would have taken preparations this time for any such event. And as you say, a pro-Trump reporter firing the same question, commenting on his suit, how much better it was this time. And Zelensky just quipped, "Well, I see you're wearing the same suit as last time," all with a smile on his face, with a slight adjustment of his wardrobe where he had a collared jacket on. But of course, Donald Trump seemed in a warmer mood as well, which makes you wonder, to what extent it was a White House strategy to give Volodymyr Zelensky such a public dressing down last time. But I think President Zelensky fielded it well. But I was watching nervously. It is a tightrope that you walk, and we know how quickly the mood can change. But as I say, he's made it to the next stage. So let's see whether he can keep that rapport going.
Indeed. And as you said, James, we take it from now hour by hour to see what comes next. But our Europe correspondent, James Waterhouse, there for us. Great to get your perspective. And I want to get another European perspective now. My next guest is Vygaudas Ušackas. He was a former EU ambassador to Russia, also previously the Lithuanian ambassador to the US and the UK. Very good to have you with us on BBC News. Take us through what you think the challenges are for European leaders sitting in the room. They're sitting there with President Trump, these European leaders. How difficult is this task that lies ahead for them?
Well, it's a big opportunity for both, for Zelensky and for half a dozen European leaders. And talking about them, I think it's it's a chance to grasp European hour to move from the geopolitical irrelevance into geopolitical significance, because up till now, it was Donald Trump and Putin who were making the shots and shaping negotiations on the future end of war in Ukraine, while it is taking place in Europe. And I think, from my point of view, 7 European leaders came not just to support psychologically or politically Vladimir Zelensky, who deserves that support, but also they have delivered something to the table at the White House. They must come with a contribution which would be tangible and understandable for Donald Trump, a contractual man, a real state mogul, and the one who is changing world diplomacy from traditional long-term negotiations into the making the deal. So what we heard today from Donald Trump is that there's going to be some security guarantees where U.S. will be involved, but I very much doubt that we will see U.S. military involvement or U.S. troops on the ground.
What do you think that will look like then? Are we talking about U.S. weapons supporting European troops on the front lines if some sort of security guarantee is agreed?
Well, I think Europeans have been working already on a potential contribution to so-called deterrent force in Ukraine. And I think that's what those 7 leaders will spell out today to to Donald Trump, and then will be conveyed to Putin, with understanding that U.S. will continue to provide support, but no more donations, no more gifts. We're going to pay the price for military equipment and the know-how, and hopefully such a valuable asset as intelligence. So we are moving into a new contractual relationship, which is going to be affirmed one more time, I think, with the incoming deal on Ukraine.
How critical is this moment, do you think, for Europe, for European leaders?
Absolutely. It's of paramount importance. It was Putin who unprovoked invaded independent country Ukraine, which is part of Europe. Ukraine was invaded because of its aspirations, first of all, to become a member of European Union. I remember myself in 2013, 2017, when the first war took place, when Crimea was illegally annexed and the war started in Donbass. It was not because of NATO, because there was no, tangible possibility for Ukraine to become NATO. There was no, and there is still no support from US. But Putin reacted the way he reacted because Ukraine was about to sign a European Association Agreement with the European Union, and he was afraid if Ukraine will change into a democratic, prosperous, legitimate country, that will make an impact to the Russians, and we may see some changes within Russia itself.
Oh, okay, great.
As someone who served as an ambassador here in the U.S., what do you make of the Trump administration's approach to this conflict and saying, we have to have a trilateral summit? President Trump says he will call President Putin today. Do you think that this is the right approach?
Well, we have an unconventional sheriff in the White House. It's a very different personality who brings, who changes not only U.S. but changes the world. And he was very transparent throughout the years, both in power and then, in waiting again to be elected. And he said he's going to change. He's going to change, America, and he will change relationship with its allies and with its enemies. So Europe had had enough time to prepare for this new contractual relationship. And the most important, it's about European hour. We need to see Europe not only investing but building a strong military power, and we need Germany to be militarized because without Germany we cannot see Europe to deter Russia in the future.
And Ambassador, I want to ask you as well about how you see President Putin in all of this. You know, Ukraine has been very clear they do not believe he can be trusted. What kind of agreement can actually be durable with President Putin?
You know, you can only gain his respect by power, by stronghold of having Western troops on the ground and deterring any kind of temptation for him to relax and then to relaunch the war, either on Ukraine or even on the eastern flank NATO member states. So it will require staying power from Europeans. It will require, support from Americans on contractual basis, and we'll need to send our boys and girls so as to support Ukrainians and deter Russia. Russia respects the power. Russia respects military presence, and that's hopefully will be part of the deal, which will certainly not be pleasant for anyone, but it will require European military presence.
Okay, Ambassador, it's been very good to get your perspective, a really interesting analysis there. Thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So let's just show you the live images that we have for you at this hour. We have some images, of course, of the White House and also of the family photo room. It looks like it's happening now. There it is. Here you see President Trump, President Zelensky, followed by Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president. It looks like they're making their way here for the family photo. Let's listen in, hear if we can hear anything coming from this.
That was not a great day. Is everything okay? You all set? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, an extraordinary image there. President Trump standing next to President Zelensky, European leaders there for a family photo. President Trump looking quite serious in the middle of that photo, and we saw him then walk away with President Zelensky and the European leaders trailing just behind him. So a real show of force of European leaders giving their solidarity to President Zelensky of Ukraine. This after, as we mentioned, a fairly friendly exchange between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. And you see a bit of a shaky image here. These are the pool cameras, so those cameras that have been tasked with following the action inside the White House today. And look, you can just see that's the Vice President, J.D. Vance, just rushing out there for a moment. You see President Trump's Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles there, the woman in the blue suit. I believe Steve Witkoff is just on that side. And on the other side, we can't see him just yet, but the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, I believe, is just where Susie Wiles is, where we saw a moment ago. There comes the vice president again as he walks towards this group of President Trump's closest advisors, his cabinet members. So look, this is the table set for talks. Fascinating. This is the format we're going to see now, it looks, that we're going to see these talks begin. We know from the White House, an official telling the BBC, that these were the people who were going to be on hand for these talks for President Trump. Indeed, his Secretary of State, his Vice President, his Special Envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, and also his Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff. There is President Trump. Looks like he's about to take his seat at the center of the table. The NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, you see in the front of your screen, embracing I can't exactly see who he's embracing, but one of President Trump's team's members, I believe, there. And behind him, that's the Finnish Prime Minister, Alexander Stubb. And you see the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, making his way to the table as well. So it looks like there is the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, as well, if I have spotted him correctly on my screen. They're all lining up to take their seats as they're about to begin their negotiations. There, the British Prime Minister greeting J.D. Vance, the Vice President, who, of course, just recently was having his holidays in the UK and met with the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy, spoke with European leaders about the war in Ukraine. And the bright jacket here, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and she's also greeting the Vice President as she moves to take her place. Amazing to see all of these European leaders really in the room as they take their seats, as President Trump has, to begin talks. We anticipate that we won't get on-camera view of all of the negotiations here. He's seated right next to the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. This image says it all, doesn't it? The opportunity for European leaders to sit directly next to President Zelensky and President Trump to state their priorities. They've made very clear they want to see a stop in fighting. And they want to make clear to President Trump that any territorial concessions have to be coordinated with Ukraine. Ukraine itself saying Russia cannot be rewarded. So these are the images we're seeing from inside the White House. Really extraordinary to see this image, isn't it? President Trump appears talking right now. I don't know if we can hear anything. We can try to listen in. Okay, seems we can't hear very much there, but really interesting images to be getting. And it appears, I don't know if these images are still coming through. Yeah, they are.
Do you guys want to take some questions?
Okay, there we go. President Trump, let's look at these images now.
Sid. Hi, Mark. Yeah, good. Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to have you here. Special place. White House is special no matter where you're from. Represents so much, and it really is beautiful. And thank you for all of the wonderful things that took place today. We've had a very successful day thus far. Important discussions as we work to end the killing and stop the war in Ukraine. We're all working for the same goal. Very simple goal. We want to stop the killing, get this settled. I've just had the honor of being with President Zelensky and all of the discussions that we've had. We covered a lot of territory. And I spoke indirectly with President Putin today. We're going to call President Putin right after this meeting. I'm sure we're going to have a solid meeting, good meeting, maybe a great meeting. And we're going to try and work out a trilat after that and see if we can get it finished. Put this to sleep, because this is not since the Second World War has there been anything like this. So I'm honored to welcome NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who's a great gentleman, great political leader in Europe generally, but now he's the NATO Secretary General, and you're doing a fantastic job. Thank you very much, Mark. Prime Minister Starmer of the United Kingdom, our friend and my friend, and doing really well, and people like him a lot. We all like him. Everyone knows President Macron of France, who's been with me from the beginning, one of the first people I met as a foreign dignitary, and I liked him from day one. And I like him even more now. That's pretty good. That's unusual. That's a pretty unusual thing. Prime Minister Meloni of Italy, who's really a great leader and an inspiration over there. She's served now, even though she's a very young person, she's served there for a long period of time relative to others. They don't last very long. You've lasted a long time. You're going to be there a long time. Chancellor Merz of Germany, who is a very strong person and a very strong leader and very highly respected in Germany. And he's my friend, and it's an honor to have him as my friend. Thank you very much. Very good. You look great with your tan. Where did you get that tan? I want to get a tan like that. President Stubb of Finland, and he's somebody that, where are we here? Huh? We're oh, you look better than I've ever seen you look. But you've done a great job, and we wanted to have you here because you're somebody that we all respect. And you've had a lot to do with the success, I think, and the potential success. And thank you very much for being here. We appreciate it. And the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who is somebody that we just made a big deal with all of those countries. I don't know. I think you might be more powerful than all these guys at this table. I don't know. But we had a great negotiation, and you're respected all over the world. So I want to thank you very much for being here. It's a great honor to have you. The Alaska Summit reinforced my belief that while difficult, peace is within reach, and I believe that in a very significant step, President Putin agreed that Russia would accept security guarantees for Ukraine, and this is one of the key points that we need to consider, and we're going to be considering that at the table also, like who will do what, essentially. I'm optimistic that collectively we can reach an agreement that would deter any future aggression against Ukraine, and I actually think there won't be. I think that's even overrated, largely overrated, but we're going to find out. And I think that the European nations are going to take a lot of the burden. We're going to help them, and we're going to make it very secure. We also need to discuss the possible exchanges of territory, taking into consideration the current line of contact. That means the war zone, the war lines that are pretty obvious, very sad actually to look at them, and negotiating positions. President Putin, also you have President of Ukraine, who is you just met a little while ago, and we're going to try and get a three-party meeting maybe as soon as we can, and I have a feeling you and President Putin are going to work something out. Ultimately, this is a decision that can only be made by President Zelensky and by the people of Ukraine working also together in agreement with President Putin. And I just think that's very good things are going to come of it. So I hope we have a good meeting. And if we can have a good meeting, I'll set up a meeting with President Putin. And if you'd like, I'll go to that meeting. And not that I want to do that, but I will do that because we want to save a lot of people from dying. A lot of people are dying, and we got to save them. We got to save it. 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people sometimes a week. All of us would obviously prefer an immediate ceasefire while we work on a lasting peace, and maybe something like that could happen. As of this moment, it's not happening, but President Zelensky and President Putin can talk a little bit more about that. You know, in the 6 or so wars that we stopped, we haven't had a ceasefire. And so I don't know that it's necessary. You can do it through the war, but it would be, I like the ceasefire from another standpoint. You immediately stop the killing. But I believe a peace agreement at the end of all of this is something that's very attainable, and it can be done in the near future. With all of the wars that I got involved in, we only have this one left. Of course, as I walk out the door, there'll probably be a new one starting, and I'll get that stopped too. But I thought this was going to be one of the easier ones. It's actually one of the most difficult. They're very complex. The next step would be for a trilateral meeting, and that will be worked out. And I just look forward to working and having a great result. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about, and we're really honored you guys came over. I mean, these are the heads of major countries and respected all over Europe. And they speak for, largely, I think I should say, but pretty much for the other countries of Europe. And we will come to a resolution today, I think, on almost everything, including probably the security. And that's pretty much the story. I'd like to say, Mr. President, would you like to say something? You have the media. If you want, you could come over and you could stand, you could use mine, or you could just turn around, whichever you feel comfortable with.
Thank you so much. I can speak without microphone. Thank you so much. I think that we had very good conversation with President Trump.
Very good.
And it really was the best one. Or sorry, maybe the best one will be in the future. But it was really good. And we spoke about very sensitive points. The first one is security guarantees, and we are very happy with President that all the leaders are here, and the security in Ukraine depends on the United States and on you and on those leaders who are with us in our hearts. They have been online before yesterday.
If you're just joining us here on PBS, we are watching the meeting going on right now in the White House between President Trump and European leaders and President Zelensky.
Guarantees. This is very important that the United States gives such strong signal and is ready for security guarantees. The second point, or maybe the first, humanitarian direction, very important to exchange all the prisoners, and I think that President will help, and I was very thankful to your wife again, Mr. President, for the letter about our abducted children, and I hope that really it can be a historic role for the people to bring kids back to the families and be happy.
Get the people back, yeah.
Yes, this is so important, and I'm happy that we discussed it, this track with President Trump, and I hope that we will find decisions. And then what is very important, that all the sensitive things, territorial, etc., we will discuss on the level of leaders during trilateral meeting, and President Trump will try to organize such meeting, and he said that he will come or not come. Ukraine will be happy if you will participate.
Want me there, I will be there.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is very important. Yes, so security guarantees, bring kids back, and all our people, not only warriors, first of all warriors, and all the civilians, journalists, a lot of people in prison. So we need them back. And guarantees which will work for the years. We spoke about it, and I showed the President a lot of details on the battlefield, on the map. Thank you so much. Thank you for the map, by the way.
Good map.
It was great. I'm thinking how to take it back.
We'll get to it.
No. I think that we had constructive, specific meeting, and I'm very thankful to all the leaders who are here, and you help a lot, and so we're happy that we have such big unity today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much,
Hosting us.
Mr. President. And I think you'll see that President Putin really would like to do something else. I think when we set that up, when we do, I think it's going to be when, not if. I think you're going to see some really positive moves. I know there's over 1,000 prisoners, and I know they're going to release them. Maybe they're going to release them very soon, like immediately, which I think is great. But we're going to set that up today after this meeting. So very good and great remarks. I appreciate it. Mark, as head of NATO, maybe you could say a few words, please.
Yes, I will be very brief. I really want to thank you, President of the United States, dear Donald, for the fact that you, as I said before, broke the deadlock basically with President Putin by starting that dialogue. And I think it was in February that you had the first phone call, and from there we are now where we are today. And that is, I think, if we play this well, we could end this. And we have to end this. We have to stop the killing. We have to stop the destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure. It is a terrible war. So I'm really excited. And let's make the best out of today and make sure that from today onwards we get this thing to an end as soon as possible. I really want to thank you for your leadership, what you are doing for Volodymyr, but of course also all the European colleagues. It is really crucial. And the fact that you have said, I'm willing to participate in the security guarantees is a big step. It's really a breakthrough, and it makes all the difference. So also thank you for that.
Well, NATO also has agreed from 2% to 5%, which is something that is a massive amount of money. And it's 2% that wasn't always paid to 5% that is paid. That's a big difference. And so we appreciate that. That was a great move. Thank you very much. Ursula, maybe on behalf of the Commission, you could say a couple of words.
Yes. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a very important moment. Indeed, we are here, Europeans, as friends and allies. We had a fantastic NATO summit. Together as the two largest and biggest economies in the world, we had the largest trade deal ever agreed. And now we are here to work together with you on a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. Stop the killing. This is really our common interest, stop the killing. And indeed, it's very good to hear that we're working on the security guarantees, Article 5 lies security guarantees, so important. But I want to thank you also that you mentioned the thousands of Ukrainian children that have been abducted. And as a mother and grandmother, every single child has to go back to its family. This should be one of our main priorities also in these negotiations, to make sure that the children come back to Ukraine, to their families.
Thank you. And we did. I was just thinking we're here for a different reason, but we just a couple of weeks ago made the largest trade deal in history. So that's a big thing, and congratulations. That's great. Thank you very much, Ursula. Mr. Chancellor from Germany, a very great leader.
Mr. President, Donald, many thanks for having us today. I think this is extremely helpful that we are meeting and hearing that the two of you are having such a good meeting today here in Washington. The next steps ahead are the more complicated ones now. The path is open. You opened it last Friday. But now the way is open for complicated negotiations. And to be honest, we all would like to see a ceasefire, the latest from the next meeting on. I can't imagine that the next meeting would take place without a ceasefire. So let's work on that, and let's try to put pressure on Russia, because the credibility of these efforts we are undertaking today are depending on at least a ceasefire from the beginning of the serious negotiations from next step on. So I would like to emphasize this aspect and would like to see a ceasefire from the next meeting, which should be a trilateral meeting wherever it takes place.
Well, we're going to let the president go over and talk to the president, and we'll see how that works out, and if we can do that. I will say, and again I say it, in the 6 wars that I've settled, I haven't had a ceasefire. We just got into negotiations, and one of the wars was, as you know, in the Congo was 31 years long. Another one that we settled last week with 2 great countries was 35 years going on, and we had no ceasefire. So if we can do the ceasefire, great. And if we don't do a ceasefire, because many other points were given to us, many points were given to us, great points. Please, Georgia, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Donald, Mr. President, for hosting us today in this important meeting. And I think it is an important day, a new phase, after 3 years and a half that we didn't see any kind of sign from the Russian side that there was a willing for dialogue. So something is changing, something has changed, thanks to you. Thanks also to the stalling in the battlefield, which was achieved with the bravery of Ukrainians and with the unity that we all provided to Ukraine. And the reason why I mention it is that we also have to remind that if we want to reach peace and if we want to guarantee justice, we have to do it united. So that's why it's a very good day, the one we are in. You can obviously count on Italy as it was from the beginning. We are on the side of Ukraine, and we do absolutely support your efforts towards peace. We will talk about many important topics. The first one is security guarantees, how to be sure that it won't happen again, which is the precondition of every kind of peace. I'm happy that we will discuss about that. I'm happy that we will begin from a proposal which is the, let's say, Article 5 model, which was Italian at the beginning. So we are always ready to bring our proposals for peace, for dialogue. It's something we have to build together to guarantee peace and to defend the security of our nation. So thank you, Mr. President, for hosting us.
Thank you very much. Emmanuel?
Thank you, Mr. President, for organizing this meeting and for your commitment. And everything was said, but I just have to say here, everybody around this table is in favor of peace. And we work very hard, and we've worked very hard during the past few years to have a peace which is a robust and long-standing peace. This is why the idea of a trilateral meeting is very important, because this is the only way to fix it. And by the way, I think as a follow-up, we would need probably a quadrilateral meeting, because when we speak about security guarantees, we speak about the whole security of the European continent. And this is why we are all united here with Ukraine on this matter. In order to organize such a trilateral meeting, your idea to ask for a truce or ceasefire, at least to stop the killings, as we discussed, is a necessity. And we all support this idea. And in order to have such a long-standing peace for Ukraine and for the whole continent, we do need the security guarantees. And the first one is clearly a credible Ukrainian army for the years and decades to come. And the second one is our own commitment, all of us. And we worked very hard during the past few months among the coalition of the willings, with the support of NATO, to build the different pillars of security guarantees and our commitments. And you can be sure that the Europeans are very lucid about the fact that they have their fair share in these security guarantees for Ukraine, but their own security is clearly at stake in this situation. So you can count on us, as we can count on you, in order to deliver this robust peace for both Ukraine and Europe.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you for hosting us here. Can I start where Emmanuel started, which is we all want peace. The war in Ukraine has had a huge impact, particularly on the Ukrainians who've borne the brunt of it, but it's also had an impact on Europe and on the United Kingdom. There's not a family or community that hasn't been affected. And when we talk about security, we're talking about the security not just of Ukraine, we're talking about the security of Europe and the United Kingdom as well, which is why this is such an important issue. I think this is such an important meeting. As a group, I think we've had a discussion on the phone a number of times, Mr. President, but be able now to be around the table to take it forward. And I really feel that we can, I think, with the right approach this afternoon, make real progress, particularly on the security guarantees, and your indication of security guarantees of some sort of Article 5 style guarantees fits with what we've been doing with the Coalition of the Willing, which we started some months ago, bringing countries together and showing that we were prepared to step up to the plate when it came to security. With you coming alongside, the US alongside what we've already developed, I think we could take a really important step forward today. A historic step, actually, could come out of this meeting in terms of security for Ukraine and security in Europe. I also feel that we can make real progress towards a just and lasting outcome. Obviously, that has to involve Ukraine, and a trilateral meeting seems the sensible next step. So thank you for being prepared to take that forward, because I think if we can ensure that that is the progress out of this meeting, both security guarantees and some sort of progress on trilateral meeting of some sort to bring some of the difficult issues to a head, then I think today will be seen as a very important day in recent years in relation to a conflict which has gone on for 3 and a bit years, and so far nobody's been able to bring it to this point. So I thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. And, you know, it's very interesting because this is the first for the White House. You can't say that very often. It's seen a lot over the years, since 1800, 1799, to be almost exact. But this is the first where we've had so many prime ministers, presidents, the heads of European nations. And by the way, Alex, I'd like you to say a couple of words, too. You're a young, powerful man. Before I finish up, I want you to say a couple of words. Go ahead.
I'll take the notion of youth back to my wife and try to convince her. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think in the past 2 weeks we've probably had more progress in ending this war than we have in the past 3.5 years. And I think the fact that we're around this table today is very much symbolic in the sense that it's Team Europe and Team United States helping Ukraine. And the progress that we're looking out of this meeting is about the security guarantees, which are a big part of this. And then, of course, moving towards a process with a trilateral meeting with you and President Putin and President Zelensky. Some of the international media might wonder, why is the President of Finland here? I think the reason is probably that we might come from a small country, but we have a long border with Russia, over 800 miles. And we, of course, have our own historical experience with Russia from World War II, the Winter War and the War of Continuation. And if I look at the silver lining of where we stand right now, we found a solution in 1944, and I'm sure that we'll be able to find a solution in 2025 to end Russia's war of aggression and find and get a lasting and just peace. The situation is very difficult, but that's why we're here.
Thank you, Alex, very much. Good job. So we're going to be meeting for a while, and we're going to discuss some of the issues. And I don't think there's any issue that's overly complex. It's at a point now where people want to do things. I really do believe. I've known him for a long time. I've always had a great relationship with him. I think that President Putin wants to find an answer too. And we'll see. And in a certain period of time, not very far from now, a week or 2 weeks, we're going to know whether or not we're going to solve this, or is this horrible fighting going to continue. We'll do our best to get it ended. And I believe you have two willing parties, and usually that's good news, but two willing parties that want to make a deal. And we'll journey together, and we'll go over, and we'll see if it can be done. And it's possible it might not be able to be done. On the other hand, it's possible it will, and we're going to save thousands and thousands of lives a week. And so it's something we really have to do. And, or at least we have to give it our best. It's all you can do. You can give it your best. But I think we may have a very good outcome. So I want to thank you all, and the media, I want to thank you. We're going to be staying here for a little while. Then we're going to walk over to the Oval Office, and we're going to have another little discussion about similar matters. And then they're going to go home to their great countries and report. And I'm going to remain here and work, and you're going to go and work. We're all going to be working. We may be in a different location, but that's what we know how to do, is work. But I want to thank the media. Has been actually very fair, generally speaking, very fair. I think it's important that they're fair, because this is a very important subject. We have to get it ended. And so that's all we ask for, is fairness with the media. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, President Trump, they're wrapping up a meeting and open press availability, both at the same time, with the European leaders on hand, President Zelensky on hand. Very, very interesting remarks made there by each leader, commending President Trump on bringing these leaders together, on working towards peace in Ukraine. Interesting as well, we heard the French and German leaders in particular push the point of the need for a ceasefire before further talks can take place. It was the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who said it first, saying there has to be a truce, and he cannot imagine another meeting happening, so a trilateral meeting with Presidents Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, without a ceasefire being in place, to which President Trump responded to say, well, you know, it'd be great if there's a ceasefire, but we have to see what's possible, more or less. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, then echoed what the German Chancellor said and said, we have to have a ceasefire, we have to have a truce as well. So clearly laying down the line that we've heard from Europeans and from President Zelensky. They want to see a stop in fighting, evidenced, of course, by the fact that we saw more strikes overnight in Ukraine, killing 10 people. So a great opportunity there to listen into the atmosphere among President Trump as all of those leaders commended him, and he said he was honored to welcome them to the White House. They're going to go work now, as he said. They're going to have talks, in particular on security guarantees, and there the family photo we saw a short while ago. Let's talk about all of this with the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, who is joining us. Very good to have you with us on BBC News. I just want to get first your reactions to what we saw and heard there with the leaders from Europe and President Trump on hand.
Well, I mean, what we've heard so far has more been sort of press points. I noted that the European leaders have been in the White House for more than 3 hours without so far any more substantive discussions. I hope they go down now to their somewhat more hard-nosed discussions about the details. And I think it was worth noting, as you noted as well, that both Chancellor Merz and President Macron brought up what I believe is essential. You need a ceasefire in order to make it possible to start the progress towards peace. I think it is an illusion that you can put the question of ceasefire aside and believe that you can have the war continuing and some sort of progress towards peace at the same time. Simply not going to happen. So I think it was good that that point was made very explicitly by those two senior leaders. Then exactly what's going to come out of the discussion on security guarantees, that remains to be seen. But I hope they have some sort of detailed plans and detailed ideas on what that actually means. But of course, the security guarantees comes in first after we have a ceasefire. And perhaps even if we have a peace, although I think peace is a rather elusive concept that's going to take some time.
Interesting, Mr. Bildt, that President Trump said a bit earlier, not in this last moment meeting with European leaders, that a ceasefire can be disadvantageous. I think he's speaking of Russia there. He also said in the conflicts that he has been negotiating on, a ceasefire can be difficult to implement. What do you make of President Trump's position on this?
No, first, it is totally contrary to the position that he had up until he met President Putin, because the number one item that he had been pressing since January, since he came into office, was the demand for immediate ceasefire. And the Ukrainians and the Europeans have gone along with it, endorsed it enthusiastically, and expected him to start to put pressure on Mr. Putin to achieve that. But then we had the Alaska U-turn, and that is, of course, the reason why all of the European leaders, in a slight state of alarm, have rushed to Washington to see what's going to come out of this. So ceasefire is something that we knew that Putin was against. That's hardly news. And evidently, Mr. Putin was able to convince Mr. Trump in Alaska that that was not a good way to go. But I would argue, as Chancellor Merz did, as President Macron did, it is the only way to go. And that's also the historical record. Look at Korea, look at Bosnia. Even Mr. Trump, until days ago, was boasting that he managed to organize a ceasefire between India and Pakistan, true or not true. But he boasted about that only until days ago.
Are now, it seems, willing to provide...
And Mr. Bildt, just before we let you go, on security guarantees, that seems to be the meat of the discussion, really, now going forward with European leaders. What will be the key details that they'll have to hammer out?
Well, what does it really entail? I mean, a security guarantee could be a paper, but NATO is, for example, more than a paper. It's an organization. It is military forces. It is operational planning. It is readiness to really deploy forces to defend respective countries. Which countries are ready to, in an emergency, deploy forces into Ukraine against Russia? I mean, that needs to be sorted out. And it needs to be far more than just some sort of verbal declaration. Is it something that requires Senate confirmation in the US? Is it something that requires parliamentary ratification in Europe? Is it sometimes that requires a separate organization to be set up for security support to Ukraine? Lots of issues. I hope they move that issue forward because it's a huge one.
Mr. Bildt, notably absent from the discussion that we're seeing, and certainly from the press availabilities, is any discussion of Ukrainian territory. We heard them briefly refer to a map, but it appears that that is not as much the focus of discussions today. Of course, we don't know what will happen behind closed doors, but it appears as of now they're talking primarily about security guarantees.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. I mean, one of the things that I think is also slightly illusional, I have to say, sort of to be negative, is that these issues can be sorted out in a trilateral meeting between Mr. Zelensky or President Zelensky and Putin with help of President Trump. This has to be sorted out well before that. I think that sort of trilateral meeting is probably some way into the future.
Mr. Bildt, looking at the images that we've seen of President Trump sitting with European leaders, are you optimistic that they will be able to work out an agreement that will be to the benefit of Ukraine and to European security?
I sincerely hope. I mean, it's going to be dependent upon how sort of, and I assume that will be the case. That, as said, we had the press points and the European leaders saying nice things about Mr. Trump. That's part of the choreography these days. But I hope that they deliver somewhat more hard-nosed messages to him in the more private conversations, that he gets back on track with putting pressure on Russia. Without pressure on Russia, there will not be peace. That is a fairly basic understanding that needs to be hammered in with some force.
I wonder what you make of the Russian Foreign Ministry putting out a statement before these talks started, again saying no sort of security guarantees involving European troops will be viable for Russia.
No, that's a Russian position. That is hardly surprising. I mean, they're going to be dead against that. But I think our answer to that should be that's no business of yours. The security of Ukraine is up to Ukraine. And if Ukraine wants to have the help of others for that security, that is the business of Ukraine. Russia has nothing to do with that particular issue. That's not an issue that's going to be that easy to resolve, because the Russians are going to try to do whatever they can to prevent security assistance to Ukraine, because they want a weak Ukraine, not a strong Ukraine.
Okay, Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister of Sweden. Always good to get your analysis here on BBC News. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And as Mr. Bildt said, the question of security guarantees there will be essential here. And certainly that's what President Trump says they will be discussing behind closed doors now. What could that look like? What role will Europeans play? What role would the U.S. play in guaranteeing that Russia does not attack Ukraine again? But so many more questions, of course, on the table, including that of a ceasefire brought up by both the French and German leaders, something that President Trump wasn't immediately receptive to. But let's see what is reached here, what agreement is reached. We'll be back with more coverage here on BBC News. Stay with us. We're coming to you live from Washington. I'm Sumi Somaskanda at the White House. This is The Context on BBC News. We're following the high-profile meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky following the future of the war in Ukraine. Now, the two presidents were joined by European leaders at the White House in a show of support for Ukraine. I'm Sumi Somaskanda, live at the White House. A warm welcome to The Context here on BBC News. We've been following the very latest here at the White House as President Trump welcomes President Zelensky for talks on the war in Ukraine, also welcoming European leaders who he had on hand just a short while ago, speaking live to the media as well, all showing support for Ukraine as well as they came as a show of solidarity for President Zelensky in his meetings with President Trump. Let's show you the scene in the East Room just a few moments ago that we witnessed. European leaders like France's Emmanuel Macron, the UK's Sir Keir Starmer, speaking to Presidents Trump and Zelensky. You see them seated at the table there. Those talks followed a fascinating meeting between President Trump and Ukraine's President Zelensky. They met in the Oval Office for the first time since their very tense exchange back in February. And in remarks to the media, Mr. Trump said very substantial progress was being made in efforts to find peace. Mr. Zelensky thanked the U.S. leader several times for his attempts to stop the killing. President Trump also said the U.S. will be involved in security guarantees for Ukraine in the event of a peace settlement with Russia. He said the U.S. would give Kyiv good protection, as he put it, but gave few details in public. Let's play you now a clip of that conversation from earlier in the day.
We're meeting with 7 great leaders of great countries also, and we'll be talking about that. They'll all be involved, but there'll be a lot of help. When it comes to security, there's going to be a lot of help. It's going to be good. They are first line of defense because they're there. They're Europe. But we're going to help them out also. We'll be involved.
Vladimir Putin mentioned that the war will not end without addressing the root causes of this war. Have you had an understanding what are the root causes of this war?
Well, look, the war is going to end. When it ends, I can't tell you, but the war is going to end, and this gentleman wants it to end, and Vladimir Putin wants it to end. I think the whole world is tired of it, and we're going to get it ended. It was, I've done 6 wars. I've ended 6 wars, and I thought this maybe would be the easiest one, and it's not the easiest one. It's a tough one. A lot of reasons for it. And they'll be talking about it for a long time, but they'll be talking about the others. Look, India, Pakistan, we're talking about big places. When you look at, you just take a look at some of these wars. You go to Africa and take a look at that. Rwanda and the Congo, Republic of the Congo. That's been going on for 31 years. And so we've done a total of 6, and we really have 6, not including the fact that we obliterated, and it turned out to be a total obliteration, the nuclear, as you saw, the future nuclear capability of Iran. And this one, I think we're going to get solved also. I feel confident we're going to get it solved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Can you tell us about your conversations with European leaders and what they need to see to support an end to the war?
Yeah, well, we're going to be meeting with a great representative group and 7 very powerful, very big countries and great people, all friends of mine and friends of yours. And we're going to have some suggestions made. They want to see peace. They would like to see peace.
President Trump, do you think it's fair for Ukraine and for Russia to achieve a lasting and durable peace if Ukraine cedes its territories that Russia hasn't yet conquered? Do you think it's a fair peace for Ukraine?
We're going to have a lasting peace. Just to answer the first part of your question, we're going to have a lasting peace. I hope it's going to be immediately. I hope it doesn't have to go on. And I think people of the whole world is going to be very happy when that's announced.
Okay, so that was the exchange a little while ago in the Oval Office. President Trump and President Zelensky taking questions from reporters there. Vitaly Shevchenko, the Russia editor for BBC Monitoring, has been following the day with us here. Vitaly, we should say we've both of us just been looking at a really interesting photo posted by Dan Scavino, who's the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, showing President Trump and President Zelensky in front of a map of Ukraine in the Oval Office. I think we have that image. There it is at the moment. Yep, there it is. So, Vitaly, really interesting to see that, and President Trump and President Zelensky referred to this, didn't they, as they were talking a short while ago?
Yes, this must be the map we saw being carried in by one of President Zelensky's key advisors into the White House earlier today, and it shows the areas of Ukraine currently occupied by Russia, highlighted in red or a rosy kind of color. And the message is clear. President Trump, this is what Russia has taken away from us. Do not force us to agree to it. Now, what we saw at that meeting at the table involving Donald Trump, President Zelensky, and European leaders, I think was a show of them trying not to look confrontational, despite the persisting differences. I found it notable that both Friedrich Merz of Germany and Emmanuel Macron of France, they mentioned a ceasefire still as the next step before more substantial talks can take place. This is not what Donald Trump wants. This is not what Vladimir Putin wants, but they still brought it up, I thought, in a forceful kind of way. And also we have a better idea of what those leaders discussed before the journalists were allowed into that room. The conversation seemed to have been revolving around security guarantees and a trilateral meeting involving Presidents Trump, Zelensky and Putin. Now, when it comes to security guarantees, it's still unclear what they might be. We're a bit light on detail. They're discussing it. Donald Trump says that Vladimir Putin has apparently agreed to those guarantees. But the key question is what Western countries, including America, will be prepared to do to provide those guarantees. More weapons, better weapons, deployment of some troops on the ground, which is what the so-called coalition of the willing had proposed before. And when it comes to a trilateral meeting, this is a key request by Volodymyr Zelensky. How meeting Vladimir Putin face-to-face will help is another question, and whether Vladimir Putin will agree to a meeting with President Zelensky, whom he considers to be an illegitimate leader of Ukraine, that's also a big question.
President Zelensky appears open to this meeting, but I want to come back to the point that you made about a demand for a ceasefire from both the French and German leaders. You wonder now if behind closed doors that sparks might fly a bit, as those two leaders in particular, backed by other European leaders, insist that fighting has to stop. So Vladimir Putin cannot take advantage of the current situation.
Vladimir Putin is in a good place right now. His army is making slow and costly progress in Ukraine, but it's still progress. All the threats made by Western leaders and deadlines that they put for Vladimir Putin to stop attacking Ukraine, they've come and went, and nothing happened really. So there is very little reason for Vladimir Putin to just agree to any demands or threats of guarantees proposed by the West, promises to do something if Ukraine is attacked by Russia again. They remain just that, threats not really backed up by action right now. So I imagine in the Kremlin they'll be watching this meeting with a certain degree of skepticism, because it's different from what is happening behind closed doors, but what we've heard openly in the public does not have any specific suggestion that the position of the West and America has completely changed, and now they're willing and able to do more to defend Ukraine.
And before we let you go again, Vitaly, what did you make of those comments about a trilateral summit? President Trump has said it could happen very soon. It appears European leaders would support a trilateral summit, but are not convinced that the conditions exist for that to happen right away.
Vladimir Putin has been saying for Well, ever since this idea of a trilateral summit came about, he was saying that we need to do a lot of preparatory work before before a meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky is possible. Well, that sort of work was not required for him to meet Donald Trump. That meeting was really quickly arranged, not so with Volodymyr Zelensky. So that shows how unwilling he is to talk to the Ukrainian leader, how he dislikes him, doesn't see him as a legitimate representative of Ukraine. So it will take a lot of work to get the Russian president to sit down at the table with Volodymyr Zelensky. And also, it's a big question, okay, they sit down, they talk, is that going to dramatically help the cause of progress, just them being in the same room together at the same table? That is a big question as well.
Okay, Vitaly, thank you. As ever, we'll let you go listen in to hear what might be happening in the White House at the moment as those talks are underway. We understand European leaders discussing security guarantees with President Trump. At least that's what he said would be happening at this moment. Let's bring in my colleague Nick Beek from BBC Verify, who has been looking into some of the statements that President Trump has been making today and some of these media appearances through the course of the day. Nick, take us through what you've been following.
Yes, Sumi, I was listening really carefully to what you were saying and some of your guests when you were discussing the idea of a ceasefire. And we heard, didn't we, from Chancellor Merz of Germany. He was the first one, really, to raise something which was, if not contradictory, not exactly what President Trump was talking about when Mr. Merz was saying there needs to be a ceasefire. And he says it would be inconceivable, really, to his mind, that there'd be this meeting between President Trump, President Zelensky and President Putin without a ceasefire. And I think what we were seeing there is the Europeans almost trying to take the initiative back, because President Trump had said that the ball is now in the court of President Zelensky and the Ukrainians to do a deal. But I think now they're looking towards President Putin, the Europeans, saying that, look, you need to agree to some sort of ceasefire if there's going to be a lasting peace. But yeah, you're right, Sumi. We've been looking at one aspect of that, talking about a ceasefire, because President Trump has said repeatedly that he's ended 6 other wars since he's been back in the White House. And he likes to use this statistic, and he's actually said, I ended these wars without even the mention of the word ceasefire. And in the here and now with Ukraine, he's saying, yes, we'd like a ceasefire, but actually it's the lasting peace that counts. But if you look at what he said, and the Verify team have been doing that, a number of these conflicts that he says he's ended, that he's taken the credit for, there was the word ceasefire used. For example, back in May, there was the flare-up between India and Pakistan, 2 nuclear nations, and President Trump said, after a long night of talks, I've now agreed that there will be a full and immediate ceasefire. So that was a word that was used. On Israel and Iran, we saw what happened just a few months ago. President Trump posted that there will now be a ceasefire that begins. And also, after we saw the skirmishes between Thailand and Cambodia, President Trump got into this process. And then it was the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who said an immediate and unconditional ceasefire has been agreed between Thailand and Cambodia. So in summary, Sumi, there have been a number of cases which Donald Trump is citing as conflicts where he's played a leading role, and the word ceasefire has been used.
Okay, Nick Beek from BBC Verify. Really interesting to hear that. You've been looking at, of course, at all the statements that we've heard from President Trump today, but that particularly on a ceasefire is a really interesting one. Nick, thank you very much for that reporting. So we'll continue to follow what's happening at the White House here. What we know is happening at the moment is that European leaders are meeting with President Zelensky, with President Trump in the White House. They have said they will be discussing the contours of security guarantees. As Vitaly said a moment ago, the details are still light on what that could look like. But President Trump said that's exactly what they're going to be hashing out now. And we saw just a moment ago all of them meeting there in the East Room as they sat down to begin their discussion. Statements from all of the leaders in support of finding a path to peace. As we have said, interesting to see some dissonance with the French and German leaders demanding that a ceasefire must be in place before any further meeting with President Putin can take place. President Trump pushing back on that slightly. We know that President Putin has disagreed with that position. he wants to talk about a peace agreement before a ceasefire. But all of this will likely be discussed behind closed doors at the White House. So we'll keep an eye on all of this here. I'll hand to Anita in the studio in London for now.
Sumi, thank you very much. A really fascinating few hours there in Washington. Stay with us here because we will be getting some more analysis of what's been happening there from a European perspective. That's after this short break. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Welcome back to The Context, where in the last half hour we've seen President Trump holding a meeting with a number of European leaders at the White House, as well as the President of Ukraine, in a show of support for Ukraine. This was the scene in the East Room with European leaders, including France's Emmanuel Macron and the UK's Sir Keir Starmer, speaking to Presidents Trump and Zelensky. Those talks follow an amicable meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky, who met in the Oval Office for the first time since that tense exchange between the two back in February. And in remarks to the press, Mr. Trump said very substantial progress was being made in efforts to find peace. Mr. Zelensky thanked the US leader prominently for his attempts to stop the killing. And joining me now is former CNN international anchor Nina Dos Santos. Nina, really good to have you with us today to talk through everything we've been seeing today and a huge amount to go through. Let's talk a little bit about that earlier meeting with President Zelensky. What was your big takeaway from that?
Well, the big takeaway, obviously, is that Zelensky would like a ceasefire, but that doesn't appear to be forthcoming. He has been told by Donald Trump privately, it seems, and we now know that probably that is the case, that a ceasefire the US president feels is not needed at this point. That, of course, would be worrying for the Ukrainian leader and also for Europe, because it would give Russia a lot of leverage during very difficult negotiations over peace. And also from the other side of things, President Zelensky appears to be minded to say, well, look, I'm not going to hand over territory unless we sit down around the table with the leaders of the United States, Russia and Ukraine for that crucial trilateral meeting.
Yes, and then bringing in that meeting that we've just seen between all of those European leaders, President Zelensky and President Trump. It was notable, wasn't it, Nina, that while those security guarantees were mentioned again and again and again, apart from a brief mention of a map, and we've just had that picture from the White House, which we'll bring back to you in a moment or two, of, in fact, there it is, of President Trump and President Zelensky standing by a map, poring over the detail of that. A really interesting shot, I think. Apart from a brief mention of a map, no discussion of territory yet. Is that pretty much what you would have expected?
Well, from the EU leaders' perspective, what you can clearly see is that what they want to focus on is these security guarantees. They really feel that they have managed to get the US president to their side of the table with a European-led initiative here. Remember that the idea of floating the concept of an Article 5 collective defence style NATO, but not quite NATO, a security backstop for Ukraine was one that Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, came up with. And so that was what they were focused on. But what I thought was really interesting, actually listening to each one of them individually, is that they had gamed this out quite cleverly. They each had very different messages that they wanted to deliver to the US president. And it's quite unusual, having covered many EU leaders, many EU summits, you never really see them unguarded like this, without notes around the table, and having a US president chair a meeting with all these countries that essentially represent the other biggest bloc in the world.
Yes, without notes, but as you say, pretty well-rehearsed talking points for each of them.
Yes, absolutely. Let's run through them. Well, obviously, starting out with some of the leaders of the big bodies, like NATO, for instance, Mark Rutte, who's been, some EU leaders might say, a bit too deferential towards the US president.
We heard Dear Donald from him again, didn't we?
Or olaginous, you might even say. He, of course, praised the US president for being the only person who's managed to break the deadlock. You also heard Ursula von der Leyen specifically focus on the recent trade deal that the EU and the United States had finally agreed upon under much duress from the US president towards the EU. And she said, well, look, this is the biggest trade deal in the world. They're trying deliberately to conflate an accomplishment and flatter the US president and to try and bounce him into, being a bit more amenable to the EU's point of view with regards to its future security. And then when it came to the individual leaders, the issue of a ceasefire, as you've pointed out in this show, back on the table thanks to the leaders of France and Germany, and also Emmanuel Macron of France saying we shouldn't just have a trilateral meeting, we should have a quadrilateral meeting. He didn't say exactly who the fourth party would be, but I think it's pretty obvious it would be Europe.
And let's just bring in a slightly more light-hearted moment from today, because there was one at the start of the meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky when he joked with him about his clothing. You'll remember President Zelensky was criticised back in February when he last met President Trump at the Oval Office for not wearing a suit. You'll remember, I'm sure, it was a very acrimonious meeting. Take a listen.
First of all, Mr. President Zelensky, you look fabulous in that suit.
I said the same thing.
Yeah, you look good.
I said the same thing.
Yeah, looks good on
I
you.
said the one that attacked you last time. See, now he's
I remember that. Yeah, I apologize to you. You look wonderful. No, my first question for you, President Zelensky.
In the same suit. You see, I changed. You are not.
Maybe yours is much better.
A witty moment from President Zelensky there. I mean, obviously, the mood music there, very, very different from February. But what will that lead to? Will that lead to anything? If there is a better relationship now between President Trump and President Zelensky and, warm words with all the European leaders, is that going to persuade the president to basically lean back more towards the Ukrainian, the European position? Because at the moment, as you say, no leverage being, or no pressure being placed on Russia, no demand for a ceasefire, no mention of sanctions anymore on Russia.
Yeah, or indeed, at the moment, the prospect of potentially just seizing 300 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets from the central bank that are stuck in an account of the Euroclear organisation on the other side of the street from the European Union Commission. The EU also has a lot of leverage up its sleeve, but obviously one of the big things that the US president was threatening to do quite recently was to stop other countries that the US trades with in the emerging market world from continuing to buy Russian oil and gas, to turn off the taps of the Russian economy. And just a few weeks ago, of course, remember, Donald Trump himself was bemoaning Vladimir Putin's, attacks on Ukraine and how they were killing so many people and advocating a ceasefire as soon as possible. So we can see that the US president's relationship with different people, whether it's Vladimir Putin or Volodymyr Zelensky, can change on a dime, depending on whether the cameras are watching and also depending on domestic politics. And it's important to point out that the midterm elections are coming up mid-next year in spring, and campaigning for that will probably start in the autumn. And the Nobel Peace Prize is up for grabs in the autumn as well. So from Donald Trump's point of view, he really wants to get this sorted.
And another point, how much do you think those leaders of the coalition of the willing, who are right behind Ukraine, how much, though, do they also have to consider their individual national interests in terms of the interests of their country's relationships with President Trump, with the USA? And those two things are not necessarily absolutely parallel, are they?
No, obviously Keir Starmer is in the most acute position from that point of view, because the UK has the famous special relationship with the United States that he's been keen to protect at all costs. traditionally all British Prime Ministers do, but obviously at the moment the UK is outside of the European Union, having Brexited a while ago, and as such he really needs to protect that relationship, whereas the EU obviously has strength by numbers, but that doesn't mean that key figures inside the EU don't break away and speak from their own voices, and we've seen that quite a few times over the last few days. Remember, Emmanuel Macron cannot run for office after 2027, so there's a big potential power vacuum in France, which is a huge defence player in this part of the world. It's the second only nuclear power in Europe apart from the UK. And so that is a big question mark. Where will the French voice be thereafter? And Friedrich Merz of Germany is very sensitive to the fact that, he knows he needs to build up weaponry, rearm, something that Germany never wanted to do after the Second World War, and also was told it shouldn't do after the Second World War. But now Germany's facing a new foreign policy and security dynamic, and he needs to spend big to stimulate his economy and also to protect the country's security and also the European Union's security. So they do have their own agendas, they split a little bit, but on the whole, on this particular subject of security guarantees, more or less they've been singing from the same hymn sheet, with the exception of Hungary, which has always been pro-Russia and rather awkward among the bunch.
OK, Nina, for the moment, I know you're staying with us through the next hour of the programme, but thank you very much for now. Just a reminder, of course, as well as our coverage, you have the live page on the BBC News website and app. I'm looking there at the latest post from our North America correspondent, Anthony Zurcher, who is saying the Europeans pursue a praise and persistent strategy. And of course, for example, we heard Keir Starmer say that any deal that could be made would be potentially historic, and praising President Trump. Stay with us here on BBC News.
One of the only advantages of being the old guy is that I've known every major world leader in the last 30 years, and I've known them personally.
There's a thrill in not necessarily following a straight line, do you know what I mean? Trying things that are different, challenging myself.
I'm an optimist.
I'm always believing that anything can be done if you have the will to do it and if you have a clear vision.
Women are still judged by a different metric than men, and certainly judged by a different metric when they do something wrong.
I will continue on with a life of public service, so I will always support the charities and the people that mean so much to me.
When the big names talk, they talk to us.
Hello and welcome to The Context USA. I'm Sumi Somaskanda in Washington.
And I'm Anita McVeigh in London.
Tonight we're focusing on the extraordinary talks between President Trump, President Zelensky, and European leaders at the White House.
I think you'll see that President Putin really would like to do something else. I think when we set that up, when we do, I think it's going to be when, not if. I think you're going to see some really positive moves.
We spoke about very sensitive points. The first one is security guarantees, and we are very happy with President that all the leaders are here.
In order to organize such a trilateral meeting, your idea to ask for a truce or a ceasefire, at least to stop the killings, as we discussed, is a necessity. And we all support this idea.
I found it notable that both Friedrich Merz of Germany and Emmanuel Macron of France, they mentioned a ceasefire still as the next step before more substantial talks can take place.
And joining us tonight are our panel, Jeanette Hoffman, a Republican strategist and president of Marathon Public Affairs, Democratic strategist Kurt Bardella, and also today a third panelist for more on the European perspective, journalist and commentator Nino Dos Santos. Welcome.
Welcome to The Context USA. We are covering what has been a very busy day here at the White House. Anita, I know you've been following this very closely as well, with President Trump welcoming President Zelensky and European leaders here for talks today on the future of the war in Ukraine. Now, what we've seen first was that President Trump and President Zelensky appeared to have an amicable meeting in the Oval Office, certainly very different from that dust-up that we saw when President Zelensky was last here in February. And then another meeting with European leaders, the leaders of the UK, of France, of Germany, the NATO Secretary General, all on hand to discuss the future of peace in Ukraine.
Absolutely, Sumi. It's been a really extraordinary day there. Some of the main news lines coming out of those hours of meetings include President Trump saying that if everything works out today, there could be a trilateral meeting with Russia too. However, President Trump did say he didn't think there would be a ceasefire.
A second point of discussion is...
Now, President Trump also said that he held a phone call with Russia's President Putin and that he would give him a call after talks here today. So clearly coordination going on with President Putin after that summit in Alaska on Friday. Here's a bit more of what President Trump had to say earlier.
This is significant, as this has been...
We're meeting with 7 great leaders of great countries also. And we'll be talking about that. They'll all be involved, but there'll be a lot of help when it comes to security. There's going to be a lot of help. It's going to be good. They are first line of defense because they're there. They're Europe, but we're going to help them out also. We'll be involved.
Vladimir Putin mentioned that the war will not end without addressing the root causes of this war. Have you had an understanding what are the root causes of this war?
Well, look, the war is going to end. When it ends, I can't tell you, but the war is going to end, and this gentleman wants it to end, and Vladimir Putin wants it to end. I think the whole world is tired of it, and we're going to get it ended. It was, I've done 6 wars. I've ended 6 wars, and I thought this maybe would be the easiest one, and it's not the easiest one. It's a tough one. A lot of reasons for it, and they'll be talking about it for a long time. But they'll be talking about the others. Look, India, Pakistan. We're talking about the big places. When you look at, you just take a look at some of these wars. You go to Africa and take a look at that. Rwanda and the Congo, Republic of the Congo. That's been going on for 31 years. And so we've done a total of 6, and we really have 6, not including the fact that we obliterated, and it turned out to be a total obliteration, the nuclear, as you said, the future nuclear capability of Iran. And this one, I think we're going to get solved also. I feel confident we're going to get it solved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Can you tell us about your conversations with European leaders and what they need to see to support an end to the war?
Yeah, well, we're going to be meeting with a great representative group and 7 very powerful, very big countries and great people, all friends of mine and friends of yours. And we're going to have some suggestions made. They want to see peace. They would like to see peace.
President Trump,
In the red.
President Trump, do you think it's fair to, for Ukraine and for Russia to achieve a lasting and durable peace if Ukraine seeks its territories that Russia hasn't yet conquered? Do you think it's a fair peace for Ukraine?
We're going to have a lasting peace. Just to answer the first part of your question, we're going to have a lasting peace. I hope it's going to be immediately. I hope it doesn't have to go on. And I think people of the whole world is going to be very happy when that's announced. Yeah, please.
So let's talk about all of the action and activity here at the White House today with our panel tonight. We have Jeanette Hoffman, Republican strategist and president of Marathon Public Affairs, Democrat strategist Kurt Bardella, and for today's program, we have a third panelist to give us more of the European perspective on all of this, Nina Dos Santos, former CNN international anchor there in London. Great to see you all. And Jeanette, I'll start with you. President Trump, on the one hand, saying that he doesn't believe that a ceasefire is necessary. On the other hand, sitting together with European leaders. How do you see President Trump's negotiating in all of this? Do you see him leaning one way more than the other towards President Putin or towards Ukraine and European allies?
Well, I think he wants peace, number one. He's wanted it since he came into office. He ran on a platform of ending the war in Ukraine, of ending the fighting in Israel and Gaza. He wants to be known as a peacetime president. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize, right? But he's not going to demand something he knows he's not going to get from Putin. And right now, Putin is not going to agree to a ceasefire. I think he's made progress simply by having both sides coming to the table. The summit that we saw the other day with Putin in Alaska, and now Zelensky meeting with President Trump in the White House, which we haven't seen since that explosive meeting several months ago in February. If they can get to this trilateral meeting that President Trump talked about and all sides are at the table, I think that will be great progress. But right now, the big holdout here is Vladimir Putin. We know that Putin is not going to agree to anything unless he has some fear that he's going to lose something. There's some pressure on him, or if he's going to get something himself.
Kurt, I want to get your first thoughts as well on what we've seen so far today.
Well, I think that anything that doesn't end with the President Zelensky being insulted in the Oval Office and in a jousting match with the Vice President is a better ending than the last time he had visited Washington and was in the White House. And so I think that it's encouraging that in this case, tempers did not get the best of anybody. Everyone seems to be appropriately measured in what they're saying, acting responsibly. Seeing the video playing, that there's even been, some smiles in the Oval Office. It's quite a different contrast to the last time. And I think the goal is to now evolve this, move this forward, and really get President Zelensky and President Putin in the same room. Ultimately, no deal is going to ever come until these two are in the room together negotiating. And I don't think it's unreasonable for President Zelensky and European allies to put out a framework saying it would be much more convincing to believe that you actually want to make a strive towards peace if you would stop trying to murder us. That's not an unreasonable posture to take when trying to really be at a negotiating table for peace. And so now the ball is going to be in President Putin's court to see, hey, how serious are you about this? Because Zelensky showed up, the European Union has showed up, America has shown up. What will Putin do next?
And before we come to you, Nina, I want to just bring in a photo that we've seen posted on X by the White House under the banner Pursuing Peace. I think we have the picture that we can bring up. It was posted on X a short while ago. There it is. Presidents Trump and Zelensky walking closely, sharing what appears to be a smile. And under that banner, as I said, Pursuing Peace. That is significant because that was the banner that was on hand in Alaska for the summit between Presidents Putin and Trump. So the White House using the same messaging there. Nina, if you look at where European leaders are in all of this, they sat down, of course, commending President Trump for bringing all sides together. How difficult a task do you think it is for them ahead today?
I think they've had to walk a very difficult tightrope here. And in fact, they obviously gamed this out as much as they could on the fly, because these negotiations and meetings have been hastily put together. You could just see from the choreography of who was sitting where and which meeting was where that this was happening at lightning speed. But nevertheless, there was so much at stake for the Europeans in terms of their security and also their economy, because remember that they've only just managed to sort out a big trade deal after being pummeled with the threat of hugely punitive economic tariffs by the US president, that they really needed to get a few messages across. One was obviously that if there isn't any US involvement in an important enough security backstop, whether it's a NATO-light agreement like we hear is being discussed, which would be collective defense but not under the guise of NATO, if Russia were to agree to that, if there wasn't significant involvement by the United States and commitment by the United States, and that the war in Ukraine wouldn't stop in eastern Ukraine, it wouldn't stop in Ukraine at all, it would soon bleed through to European shores. And so that was one of the messages that they had. They also had other messages, like, for instance, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who, remember, won't be in office for very long, keen to point out that Europe still needs to be around the table. So Germany is trying to float this idea of a trilateral meeting between Russia, the United States and Zelensky, but on European soil. France's president is keen to push for more than that, saying that Europe should also be around the table thereafter. I think that's an acknowledgement of just how difficult it's going to be to get a peace deal done within the time frame that the US president wants, which is probably before the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded in a couple of months from now.
Kurt, I want to bring you back in again now. And I wonder, were you encouraged at all at that earlier meeting with President Zelensky when President Trump said, that he wanted to make sure that any deal would last? He said it's got to be, something that sticks, that doesn't just last for a couple of years. And he said, we'll give them very good protection, very good security. Was that a sort of thing that you were looking to see and hear?
Yeah, I think that for anyone to buy into the idea that this could be a long-lasting peace and that Putin will not try to do yet another land grab at some point, there needs to be ironclad security guarantees. And anytime that's being put out there so definitively, that is an encouraging step. That is going to be one of the main considerations in any peace deal that is brokered, is long-term security and sovereignty of Ukraine, or at least whatever is left of Ukraine after this whole thing takes its course. And again, that's the crux of the whole issue. Putin started in 2014 with Crimea, continued it when he began this war. History has shown that he, over a period of time, continues to try to grab more and more and more. And so unless there is an absolute security guarantee in place to prevent that pattern from happening, there's not going to be a deal. And President Putin has shown himself someone willing to completely, ignore the world order and just act as a tyrant. And if you need to remember, this is a one-sided war. This started with Putin as the aggressor. Ukraine is the victim. Ukraine is defending itself. And I think that's why Zelensky has been so determined not to, give up and surrender officially any land at all that belongs in Ukraine's territory.
Jeanette, President Trump clearly knows what he wants to do himself, but what do you think those closest to him, his advisors around him, are saying? And what do you think his supporters, his voters, want him to do about Ukraine and about getting to a deal?
Well, those are two different things. I mean, I think voters' support for the war has significantly declined for sending money to Ukraine. But I think, Republicans in Congress and Democrats in Congress as well, there is bipartisan support to continue funding weapons for Ukraine and to support Ukraine's fight here and allow it to be a sovereign state and allow it to be independent here. I think Kurt is right. We cannot allow Putin to continue its quest to take more of Ukraine and allow Putin to continue to unfettered here, because he will march through Ukraine. He will march through Europe if we allow him to. He's not someone that can be trusted here. I think President Trump's advisors are telling him, we want to end this, but we need to ensure peace through strength here. And I think one of the messages of the summit in Alaska the other day that was very clear was the flying of the B-2 bomber over Putin's head. The American military is strong, and we won't allow it to be undermined. And if you look at what happened in Iran, deterrence works. Iran is a key ally of Russia. It was not allowed to make a nuclear weapon. So I think, President Trump won't be tested, and I think that there will be some key guarantees in place as this war ends.
And Nina, here in London, obviously we heard those European leaders say to President Trump again and again, this was about Ukrainian security, but also about European security, the wider continent. Do you think, from your perspective, that President Trump, he obviously wants a deal, but does he think that it shouldn't be a deal at any price?
I think that when it comes to Europe's involvement in this, it's really secondary in the US president's mind, and that has become more and more obvious. The way Donald Trump appears to be thinking about the New World Order is that it is tripartite. That involves not just the United States as the first and supreme economic and military superpower in the world, but also two other countries, China and Russia, that aren't democracies. This has huge implications for the New World Order. On the one hand, what he may be trying to do is peel Russia away from China and then take on China thereafter. Perhaps he feels that business ties with Russia are first and foremost in his mind if he can get the Ukraine war situation resolved pronto, and that will help him in his quest to try and take on China economically. And Europe doesn't figure in any of those considerations. That's the main problem that all of those EU leaders know that they have to deal with in the back of their minds. They also know that they can't make weaponry as quickly as the United States. They can't make the